Should Nazis be allowed freedom of speech? The Nazi Party did a grand speech while it was in power, and if they took power again, they would no doubt eliminate it. In the 21st century, this question has been answered in a number of ways in different countries. But it was no more pressing than in the late 1940s, when the world was trying to create a post-war framework for international human rights protection. The issue was the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was finally adopted by the fledgling United Nations in late 1948. The Universal Declaration is the foundation of modern international human rights law. It is purely aspirational and imposes no obligations on states that sign up for it. But it does, like all the treaties that have followed, provide a touchstone for domestic debate about human rights. All those human rights lobbyists and activists that call for reform to state and federal law use these treaties and declarations and conventions as their guide. They are treated as gospel, as if individual rights had been codified forever and perfectly by the United Nations. The new national curriculum, for instance, will teach the concept of individual rights and liberties as if they are invented by UN bureaucrats. But, like all international law, it is shaped by the geopolitical circumstances of the time in which it was drafted. The United Nations wasn't dispassionately deciding what is a right and what is not. The organisation was juggling great power politics between the Western world and the Soviet Union. So when it came to decide on freedom of expression in the Universal Declaration, there was a major disagreement between the Soviets and the West. The Soviet Union obviously didn't protect free speech at all. One 1923 list of what was banned in Russia included books treating Soviet power and communism in a hostile manner, books of idealistic persuasion, children's literature containing elements of bourgeois moral and lauding old conditions of life, writings by counter-revolutionary authors, writings by authors perished in the struggle against Soviet power. As one post-war Russian novelist wrote from exile, what in the West is called Soviet censorship is nothing less than the Soviet air that one breathes. So while the United Nations was debating freedom of expression in the Universal Declaration, there were 2.2 million people in the Soviet Gulag. But of course, the United Nations being what it is, the Soviets were allowed to decide with the rest of the world about what constitutes free speech. Article 19 of the Declaration reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." The Soviets wanted to add something to that. They wanted to say also freedom of speech in the press should not be used for the purposes of propagating fascism, aggression, and for provoking hatred between nations. In other words, Nazis should have no free speech or freedom of assembly. The Declaration, in the Soviet view, should allow governments to ban any organisation of a fascist or anti-democratic nature. But recall that the Soviet system, the theory of fascism, was that it was a heresy of capitalism, not, as we might argue, a heresy of socialism. As the head of the Soviet delegation said, fascist elements exist in every European country except those with a people's democracy. The Western powers, being moderately intelligent, quickly realised that the Soviet concern was less about fascism and more about anti-communist agitation. As one Canadian participant said, the term fascism, which had once had a definite meaning, was now being blurred by the abuse of applying it to any person or idea which was not a communist. The Soviets, in other words, wanted the United Nations to bless its repression of speech. In this case, luckily, the Western powers won the vote, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights takes an uncompromising pro-free speech position. But the declaration was not binding. 2 decades later, the United Nations was preparing another covenant this time, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the same fight occurred. The Western powers proposed limiting restraints on speech to those which were a direct incitement to violence. The Soviet Union proposed extending the restraints to incitement to hatred. According to the Soviet-aligned Yugoslav delegation, it was necessary to suppress manifestations of hatred which, without even leading to violence, constituted a degradation of human liberty and a violation of human rights. Once again, the Western powers objected. The Australian delegation argued that people cannot be legislated into morality. This time, however, the West lost, and an expansive version which bans now incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence was amended. The same story occurred during the drafting of the International Convention for the Elimination of All Racial Discrimination. Here, the restriction on freedom of expression is even more strident. All signatories must declare an offence punishable by law, all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, or incitement to racial discrimination. Again, the clause was driven by the Communist bloc against the protest of Western powers, and once again, the Western delegations which supported freedom of speech were completely outvoted. It is a sad reflection on Europe, writes one Danish human rights advocate, that the increasing emphasis on criminalising words that wound, offend or hurt is the brainchild of the very totalitarian states with which the Western European states were locked in an ideological battle during the Cold War. The human rights movement to restrict hate speech and racial discrimination was an ideological power play by the communist bloc that was looking for human rights law to approve their suppression of political dissent. The adoption of hate speech restrictions were not intended to liberate minorities, as so many human rights advocates claim, but to restrain liberals. Quite literally, hate speech is a communist plot. In the decade following the two conventions, Western countries adopted their own forms of racial discrimination laws which prohibited, to various degrees, hatred or discrimination. It is that Soviet-initiated international law which our human rights lobbyists proclaim as the basis for the Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act, the law which Andrew Bolt was found to have breached last year. According to this law, it is unlawful in Australia today to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person or a group of people because of their race, colour or national or ethnic origin. There are as well many state anti-discrimination laws. I won't go too much into the Andrew Bolt case because you've probably read a lot about it. Suffice to say that the judge found that Bolt's columns were so offensive, so unreasonable and intolerable that they threatened Australia's basic social cohesion. A reasonable member of the community, argued the judge in this case believes that freedom of speech has boundaries. And when something goes beyond that boundary, an open and just multicultural society will perceive it to be intolerable, and so judge it to be unreasonable for the purposes of which it was said. In other words, a reasonable member of the community, according to our court system, fully supports the intent, purpose and provisions of the Racial Discrimination Act. The court certainly found that Bolt had made mistakes. But that wouldn't have been enough to find him unlawful under the Act. It was that he was inflammatory and provocative, cynical, gratuitous and derisive. The Racial Discrimination Act asks judges to assess what constitutes reasonable, fair, good faith or offensive speech. It asks them to speculate about the sensitivity of a reasonable member of the community. And it asks them to decide what is derisive. And it asks them to do all this in order to limit our basic individual right of freedom of speech. Hate speech laws are a clear and fundamental threat to this most basic individual liberty. But it is not a liberty that appears to be well loved in Australia anymore. The shift amongst intellectuals from support for freedom of speech to support for restrictions on offensive speech has, as I said, its origins in international human rights law. But the hostility to free speech seems to be spreading. In the wake of the independent media inquiry, which I'm sure you've all been following, a Canberra Times columnist attacked the vast majority of internet users who pollute the World Wide Web with their unbridled and often crudely written opinions. Excessive freedom of speech has led to a cacophony of public debate, in the words of the head of the Australian Press Council. The organisation which he leads has written that bloggers need regulation because sometimes they print or post material before facts have been adequately checked. Under the guise of freedom of speech, read another column, the internet is turning rants into mainstream debate. The title of that column was, "Some Public Debate is Worth Stifling." The Sydney Morning Herald writer Mike Carlton argued that the judge in the Berg case had justly punished dud journalism. Freedom of speech, in his view, is not a licence to smear people for their ethnicity. Human rights activists now believe that anti-discrimination laws don't go far enough. Further limits should be placed on offensive language. More groups should be protected under the Racial Discrimination Act. In July, Bob Brown first argued that newspapers should have to obtain a licence from the government before they publish. In October, he decided that journalists had to obtain a licence. And in November, he decided that media owners need to obtain a licence. Of course, the only reason you would impose a licence would be to ensure it could be withdrawn. In Brown's words, to stop journalists who do the wrong thing in their tracks. Brown argued that free speech for the press involves, through its own code of ethics, fair speech, which comes with a high degree of responsibility. Well, no, it doesn't. A right that is contingent on being used responsibly is no right at all. Who, after all, would decide what constitutes responsible? During the trial of the philosopher Socrates in 399 BC, it was 500 jurors that decided that the elderly man had brought new gods into Athens. Free speech in Athens was a right held by the community, and anybody who stood opposed to that community could therefore be silenced. In the Roman Empire, it was the emperor himself who decided whether a book was treasonous. In the medieval period, it was church councils that decided whether speech was permitted or banned. In the early modern world, ecclesiastical authorities and secular bodies banned and burned books. Then judges and censorship boards took over, and today we have a wealth of statutory and common law, domestic precedent and international doctrine to regulate what we can and cannot say.